All right, so in this video, we are now going to look at the cooking processing or the culinary spectrum when we talk about foods. This is a very simple, abridged version of what you can expect to get from a true culinary medicine class, for example, but I'm hoping to offer you some general information about how to look at the different forms of processing to better understand which forms might work for you the best. So let's go ahead and start with raw foods. Take raw foods, so let's just take an apple or an orange, something that pretty much comes directly from nature. When it comes in this form, it is a form that is the most recognizable to the body. If you remember in our last conversation, we talked about shaka and breaking it up into individual letters, which could be representative of amino acids. In a case of raw foods, if you take an apple in and it gets to the body to digest, it is really going to notice and understand most of those proteins because it comes from a very original form. The other very helpful thing about raw foods is that they're very low in terms of time intensivity. You really don't have to put that much effort into consuming a raw food. You could eat an apple whole or you could cut it into quick pieces, but it really doesn't take that much time. Now, the one big limitation when we think about raw foods is really the digestion piece. If you take certain veggies or beans and lentils or take something like raw rice, we have to cook that in order to be able to consume it. So the digestion piece is the question at hand. Another example is if you take something like a raw carrot, and in order for you to really get a majority of the nutrients in that carrot, there is some very interesting studies that talk about needing to chew that carrot hundreds of times in order to be able to get all of the nutrients. So let's say, 6 months down the line, you have been doing a great job of eating whole, real, plant-based foods as much as possible in your diet. You're feeling great, you're at a weight that you're happy with, and you're looking for maintenance. At that time, if you're having a raw carrot and really don't need every single nutrient from that carrot, go for it, right? But especially if you're beginning in your healing journey, especially if you're trying to start off on the right foot, you may want to reconsider the more fibrous of food, the more you want to consider some form of processing, minimal processing, to get you as many nutrients as possible. So in the carrot example, there's a lot of insoluble fiber there, and that might be what's taking so much of that effort in terms of chewing. The chewing itself is not the bad thing. The goal really is how many nutrients can I get from that food. So if there are foods that are a little bit tougher to digest, for example, a great place to consider is blending those foods. If you consider things like smoothies or soups, the amount of effort that goes in is still quite minimal comparative to complete cooking processes. You're putting everything into one. It could be multiple ingredients, but beyond separating that fiber a little bit or breaking it down into something that's maybe more drinkable, most of those ingredients in your smoothie or your soup are really not getting impacted in any other way. You're not adding heat to it, or you're not maybe adding oils to it. So it really does matter what ingredients you're putting into that smoothie or soup and how many ingredients. But overall, when you talk about blending things like veggies or fruits and really trying to get them to be mashed up, that plays a huge role in improving the digestibility of those foods. The other important thing to understand is that the fiber doesn't go anywhere. The fiber just gets a little separated, and so you're able to digest it a little bit better. So between raw foods and blended foods, these are two really good places to consume a lot of foods. But as mentioned, there are going to be certain foods, even in plant protein world, even in plant-based world, that just have to be processed in some way, shape, or form. Take something like oats, or if we're going to talk about beans or rice again. All of these things need some form of processing in order for us to really be able to consume them as easy as possible. So cooking, now we start looking at what is the least I can do to transform that food into something I can digest without dramatically impacting that protein. If you can remember what we talked about, they're very fragile, correct? So if a protein is fragile, if the shaka, we want SHAKA to be as visible as possible, to your body. We want to minimize how much damage we create. If you remember in a previous conversation when we had talked about the microbiome conversation with things like the immune system, we really want to avoid that yellow category as much as possible and offer as much green in terms of the signaling as possible. So what are ways to do that? There are a couple of very easy ways to try to reduce what we call age formation. Age is advanced glycated end products which come from certain processing of food, and it's mainly impacting proteins. So what can we do to try to reduce these byproducts or reduce these inflammatory products? Number one, fiber. Fiber is extremely protective. Please go back and take a look at that video if you haven't already. Fiber can be the glue to kind of keep nutrients together until they are meant to be broken down by that microbiome, and or it can be a beautiful saran wrap or protective layer to try to protect these small nutrients from getting damaged. So foods that are higher in fiber, if you have to cook them, it makes it a lot less damaged. This is extremely important if you're cooking animal protein. Animal protein doesn't have fiber. Fiber comes from plant-based foods. And so if you're planning to cook or consume animal protein, how can you surround it with a ton of fiber? That is the question I want you to ask yourself. The next thing is the base. Water does not transform or alter a protein or create as many ages or that inflammatory byproduct as I had mentioned before. So is it possible for you to steam those foods, for example? Is it possible for you to boil those foods on a lower temperature? Other ways that you can consider are adding water as a general base instead of something like oil. Even if you have to add a little bit of oil in the beginning, can you add water later instead of oil so that it's not as fried, for example? So water as a base compared to oil is a much better option if it's possible for you. Temperature is another thing that you can take a look at, which is to say that immediately and drastically increasing temperature will also create more ages. This is where, if you have something cooking on the stovetop, for example, is it possible for you to slowly heat that? Or, for example, if you're planning to bake, maybe you can put the ingredients in there and then turn the heat on. These are simple ways, but more importantly, it's much less with the low temperature heating. It's much more important to not dramatically heat that food. So things like broiling, things like frying, things like grilling, they really tend to create, age production, and especially when you're using things like animal protein. So be extremely cautious. And the last piece here to think about are fats and carbohydrates. When a plant-based food comes with some fat or some carbohydrates surrounding it along with that fiber, that again really helps to reduce the amount of impact on that protein. So trying to consume a tiny bit of fat or a tiny bit of carbohydrate with that very, protein predominant meal is really a good idea, just to again help you reduce the amount of inflammation. The main focus of a meal could always be that plant protein, but these are all things that you could do to reduce the amount of inflammation in the cooking process. Going forward from here, we are basically looking at processing in itself, right? So if cooking itself is something for you to think about, now just imagine what happens when they have to package something and put it on a shelf and maintain that shelf life. Now we are talking about adding things like emulsifiers and stabilizers, antibiotics, or changing the actual genetic makeup of that food in order to be able to make it sustain until somebody buys that product. And many times in this processing, they also take out water, right? The food is dehydrated, and that loss of water increases the amount of times you're going to eat that to get full, which alters your caloric density, a topic we had talked about in relationship to things like carbohydrates. So when you start looking at processed foods, take a look at the ingredient list. On that ingredient list, if you're seeing multiple ingredients, many of which you've never heard of, you really want to be thinking about what kind of processing did this food go through, and when it enters my body, how well is my microbiome and my body going to recognize things like those proteins? That's a simple question you can ask yourself. Another simple thing you can do is when you look at an ingredient list of anything that you buy in a grocery store, if that list encompasses ingredients that you're quite familiar with, and if you had the time to make that food, for example, a hamburger patty or a veggie patty, if you had the time to make it, would you use every single one of those ingredients? Because if the answer is no, it's probably best to try to make it on your own or find a version where all of those ingredients are familiar to you and require way less processing. These are just two simple tips when you think about the utility of processing food. Now, as you move forward and try to make these active changes in your life to improve your healing and improve your digestion, just take a look at what exists in your kitchen first. Is there a way to move farther down in this end of the spectrum for things that can be consumed raw or blended? Things, for example, like frozen vegetables or frozen berries are a great option for you to be able to make more smoothies at home, rather than having to worry about the shelf life piece that might come with something like canned or anything that's even more processed than that. So just try to see what you can do to reduce the processing of a food and reduce the amount of age production or inflammation production. I apologize if this video was a little bit long, but I do hope this offers a little bit of insight on the impact of cooking for your food. See you in the next video.